Hey, hello everyone. This is the, set my pointer up here. This is the first set of slides, video on educational research fundamentals for the consumer. And I'm not going to cover everything in the chapter here. I'm just going to hit some highlights, add some of my thoughts on a couple of the main points. So I do hope that you're reading the chapter also, and then this video will serve as a supplement. So that's me. You may have already seen my intro video. Again, feel free to always email me or ask me questions. I know online courses can be kind of impersonal, so I do want to try to keep it as personal as possible. This is Chapter 1, and two main things we're going to hit here. Sources of knowledge, how we make decisions, what we consider valid sources of information. And the second is different research designs. And really, we're going to hit two of these in this class to any great depth. That's quantitative and qualitative. So we're going to hit some basic commonalities over these next couple weeks, and then we'll go into quantitative for the middle section of the course and end up by looking at some unique parts of qualitative research. So how do we make decisions? We make plenty of decisions in our life. Some are very trivial. Will you drink coffee this morning? Will you go Route 33 to work, or will you go through town? Are you going to brush your teeth when you get home from a long trip and you're really ready to go to bed? Many decisions throughout the day. We tend to have pretty routine answers to some, but even if we do, how do we decide on those answers? How do we come to the habits that we have? Other decisions are very big, such as how do we conduct our teaching or whatever we do for our job? How do we approach our career path? Are we going to go to 4 years of school? Are we going to get a master's degree? So how do we make these small and big decisions in our life? Where do we go for knowledge? Some examples here. What's the best way to relax today? What are we going to do for holidays? Legal implications of a new attendance policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about some specific questions that I've asked myself recently. So I think one of the messages you may get in grad school is that research is the answer to everything, and that's certainly not true. There are many ways that we can get legitimate knowledge. So all the years of life that you've lived up until now, all this personal experience, and even the personal experience of secondhand experience of those that you know, your relatives, your friends, stories that you hear from them, or maybe stories they heard from someone else. The further you get away from your personal experience, the more it could be subject to exaggeration, of course. So it would probably get less and less legitimate as you go on. But certainly any kind of stories are legitimate sources of knowledge. Tradition, what's always been done in your school and your family, these are legitimate. They were created for some reason. May not be completely correct, may not be correct at all, but there was a reason when they started off anyway. Authority, so we may look to people who we consider experts in whatever field it is. I always get a little bit frustrated when I see authority being misused. So a person who has authority in the field of their expertise. However, if you see a commercial for toothpaste with Shaquille O'Neal using Colgate instead of Crest, Shaquille may be an authority in basketball, but he's certainly not an authority on toothpaste. So knowing when and how to use authority is certainly a wise thing to do. Logic, reasoning through things, and research, of course, is the main topic of our course, but it's not the only way to make decisions. In fact, not even the one that you'll use most of the time. So 3 questions here. Will Gabrielle benefit by being held back in the 2nd grade next year? Of course, this question is different if you're coming from the teacher perspective, a 2nd grade teacher, for example, or the principal of a school that's trying to decide on when and how to hold back, versus if Gabrielle is your daughter. So research in general is for large, long-term scale decisions. So research is very, very important for someone who's going to be making this decision over and over and over again with many students, many different types of students, maybe high poverty students, students with disabilities. If Gabrielle is your daughter, you have to use research carefully because research results are in general for the average effect size or the average relationship. And the specifics for any one child could put that child more or less out of the range of the research results. So you have to read them carefully. What do the results apply to? Would the individual student that you're thinking about, would the results of that study generalize to that student? So using decisions that you're going to research for decisions you're going to make many, many times is very wise. Using it for an individual decision can be okay if you do it well, but you have to be much more careful. Second question, how many students should be scheduled into a 3rd grade class? This is actually really interesting because it's one of the few questions that's been done by experimental design. So as you'll read in your book, we tend not to do experiments, true experiments in education, because it's not ethical to assign students to different conditions if we think that one may be better. However, and now it's going to slip my mind here, Kentucky or Tennessee, one of them did a large-scale experiment statewide where they varied the number of students in the class to see how it affected the education. But that is very rare that you would do an experiment on that. And third, does block scheduling have an effect on students' achievement? Of course, this is something that's been studied in great deal, and there's research on both sides of this issue, which is often the case. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So, research, according to your book, is the most legitimate source for questions of this nature, if used correctly. 2 important parts there. This nature. So if there's a question that can be systematically and objectively studied, then it makes sense to use research. If used correctly, part of the issue with research, especially educational research, is there's a wide range of quality of educational studies. And because of that, you have to learn how to read a research report and what to look for as red flags that maybe it wasn't the best conducted study and maybe you shouldn't trust the results as much, or maybe it's an excellent study. And that's what we're going to learn in this course. Couple definitions there. I won't read everything on these slides, but they are summarized for you there if you want to pause and read them. So let me get into some examples where I have used research. So this cute little thing here is, I'm biased in this sense. This is my second daughter, Katie. And one of the recent examples where I used research was whether or not to vaccinate Katie, especially for all the vaccinations. There's some pretty standard ones, and then there's some that are a little more optional. And it's a hot area of debate. Some people will cite research looking at other countries who don't vaccinate nearly as much as the US does. On the other hand, what's the probability that something would happen as a result of the vaccination, either immediately or long term, and it appears to be pretty low. So a lot of the information, if you just type vaccinate your babies or something on the internet, will be emotional stories of something that happened to one person that may or may not have been connected to the vaccination. And even if it was, the chance of it happening may be so low that it may be outweighed by the risk of a disease. But that's where I wasn't sure. I had heard both sides, so I turned to research. I started looking through the abstracts, at least, of several famous studies on the topic, and eventually made my decision based on those research studies. And I won't go into the detail because I know it's an emotionally charged issue, but certainly it was something very personal to me that I did use research for. In a more professional note, explicit instruction, I'm not sure if you know what that is or not. It's basically the model of teaching where the teacher presents new content, then the teacher works with the students on the content, and then the students go home, or maybe in class with groups, whatever, work on the content that they learned. So the teacher does, then the teacher does with the students, then the students do. And you do that over and over and over again. And I'm a math teacher, so this is the most common method of instruction in my field, in math education. But there's a lot of research that says that this is not helpful for students. It's better to let them discover the mathematical connections, relationships, through doing activities and discussions, instead of just telling them the rules, the formulas, the methods of solving, then letting them practice. So this is a big issue that affects me every semester, and even in the summer. I teach summer courses. So I did a fair amount of research on whether or not it was good to use explicit instruction, whether I should, or whether it's better for me to use a more discovery-based approach to instruction. And again, like vaccination, it's a very emotionally charged issue with plenty of research, good research, published on both sides. And that's where I had to really dig into it enough to realize that both sides really had a good point, and this is often the case. So it turns out that there are times when it is very important to use explicit instruction, and then there are times when it is very important to use discovery-based instruction. And so knowing the difference of when I should use each one, even within a single course, has been important to my teaching. And that has almost entirely come through research, and then I've kind of tested it out in my classroom. So the two major approaches that we'll look at are quantitative and qualitative research. And some of the differences here, to close out the last few slides: quantitative tends to test a theory. So it tends to be deductive in the sense that there already is some kind of theory of a relationship, and now we want to test it out. So maybe we think that explicit instruction works for students who are struggling with the material, maybe the students who are coming into a class with lower amounts of background knowledge or something like that. That may be a theory. And so now we want to set up an experiment or some kind of study in order to test that theory. It establishes facts, shows relationships, predicts, or statistically describes. Whereas qualitative will tend to be inductive. you're trying to investigate, go deeper into an issue, into some kind of relationship, and come up with a theory. So this is induction versus quantitative deduction, where we're testing the theory. Qualitative, we're just trying to figure out what a good theory is, and then we can test it statistically with another study, or perhaps the same study if we're doing mixed methods. Now, these are both generalizations, and the next several slides will all be generalizations. It is very possible to use quantitative methods to come up with a theory for induction, or qualitative methods to test a theory. But in general, we come up with a theory through qualitative and test it through quantitative. The research design, quantitative is very rigorous in terms of even before you start the research, you come up with a very set methodology, and you don't want to vary from that. If you vary from that, it calls your results into questions. Whereas qualitative, it has to be flexible in order to follow where the data is going. Maybe you're interviewing subjects and a new theme comes up. Even though you didn't anticipate that theme before the study, maybe it's very important to now explore that new theme. So qualitative does change as the study goes on, as the method data collection goes on. Participants, quantitative, usually your goal is as many as possible, and typically you want to select them randomly. If not randomly, you at least want them to be representative of the overall population you're studying. Qualitative, it's not so important to choose randomly. In fact, you want to choose purposefully is a word that comes up a lot in qualitative studies. So if I'm going to look at, for example, rural education methods in mathematics, which is a study that I have conducted. I did a qualitative study, and it was important for me to look at schools that were already doing some really neat things. If I had chosen a random sample of rural schools across the US, I would have ended up with a lot of schools who don't do anything special for rural math education. Instead, the way we did it was called snowball sampling. So we first looked at experts in rural math education. We asked them if they knew of any schools or of any people that might know of schools who were doing some really cool things. Then we went to those people and asked them if they knew of people. And so by this method of asking who is the best example of this thing that we're trying to study, we came up with a list of schools and eventually chose 7 school districts across the US, and got some really interesting things. Schools creating wooden stringed instruments to teach logarithms, or a school in Vermont that was using local forests to teach algebra graphing, or an island school in Maine that was using clamming to look at statistical trends. So we came across some really cool ones because we did purposeful sampling. So much different than if we would have randomly chosen for quantitative. And that would be addressing different questions. If we want to know what's the most common method, that would have been a quantitative study, and we would have selected randomly. Qualitative, we have a specific thing that we're investigating, and we want to choose a sample that'll give us really rich data in that area. Data collection, data analysis. Quantitative has some very specific results, specific methods that we'll look at in this course. Qualitative tends to take longer to collect the data because you want it to be very natural, and sometimes it involves a large amount of interviews or watching as some process unfolds, which is one of the reasons why I did a quantitative dissertation. So if you are choosing a thesis project or a dissertation, if you're going on to a PhD, I will say that quantitative research studies finish much more quickly in general than qualitative do. So even if you are someone who's afraid of numbers, don't rule out quantitative. It does have some pretty good benefits. In your situation, in this class, we will only go through the method. So you'll be asked to write an introduction, a research question. In fact, that'll be one of your things here for Module 1, coming up with a research question, literature review, so finding out all the current knowledge about that question, that topic, coming up with your method, which in this class you'll be allowed to choose quantitative or qualitative. If you really want, you can do mixed methods and use them both, but I would suggest not to overwhelm yourself. Usually mixed methods it's wonderful, but it's something you want to get into a bit later in your research career. And then results and conclusions we won't have for our class because we won't be actually conducting the studies. So we'll get through everything that we would need to give a good research proposal. And then if you wanted to go further, you would contact IRB about your study, fill out a form, collect the data, and then do research and conclusion, which you're certainly welcome to do. But for this class, we'll just be looking at these first 4 things. Okay, and that is everything. Thank you.